Değerli misafirlerimiz, değerli basın mensupları, sevgili öğrenciler.
Distinguished guests, distinguished members of the press, distinguished students, I'd like to welcome you to our panel entitled Discriminatory Discourse and Social Media. Thank you very much for your participation and for your attention. Since 2009, Hrant Dink Foundation has been fighting against hate speech towards certain groups, and in order to promote fundamental human rights, they are conducting a media campaign to combat hate speech. And this is why we are working on learning about the international context and see what can be done in Turkey. This is why we are organizing events in Turkey. You might remember last year we have invited Toon van Dijk and Charles Husband, who is working on cultural diversity and the discriminatory role the media can play. And today we'll be hosting Professor Elizabeth Eide, working on freedom of expression and migration, gender, and global climate change, and also the online community administrator Laszlo Földi at the European Council, working in democracy, human rights, and participation areas. I'll be telling you about Elizabeth Eide, but before that, one of our partners at the media campaign, Friedrich Neumann Foundation, would like to thank them for their support. Let's give them a round of applause for all that they've done for us for this project. Elizabeth Eide, very briefly, let me tell you who she is. She is a professor at Oslo University Journalism Department and at the same time at Bergen University. Eide is working with supranational journalism, media marginalization and minorities, and she's worked as the editor-in-chief in so many areas. She's written some books and collections, and she worked with Afghani refugees for more than 3 years. She stayed in India and Pakistan, and she's also interested in literature, and she has published 5 literary works, 5 novels as well. And as a correspondent and as an editor, she has an important accumulation in the area of journalism. She's worked with migration, gender, global change, climate change, and media and journalism and areas alike. She is also the vice president of the Norwegian Pen Club. And Elizabeth Eide today will be talking to us about her cultural experience and will focus on the hate discourse that we might be using in our everyday lives, which might be hidden into the language, and how these influence otherization and how this influences the society. Now I'd like to leave the floor to Professor Elizabeth Eide. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Teşekkür. Good morning, everybody. Pleased to see so many of you here. And this is my, I think, 6th time in Istanbul, and I love coming back. So, this lecture will talk about my own experiences from the terror in Norway that we witnessed on the 22nd of July more than 2 years ago, and the darkness that surrounded that act of terror, and also our previous experiences with minority representation in the Norwegian media, and I'll also tell you how this is linked up with European discourses. Norway is not an isolated island. I'll talk also about the public sphere and the social media, and ask some questions about hate speech and freedom of expression. Are there any limits to be drawn? Are there any ways to stop the hate speech? I think also, when I lecture at home for my students, I say to them that please, if anything is unclear, if there's anything you'd like to ask, you are allowed to interrupt me. This rule also applies here. So feel free. Okay? But my journey starts east. It starts in India. And it starts with nation, majority, and minority. First, a quote from the great Indian leader who led the struggle for independence of India, Mahatma Gandhi, who says that a nation should be judged by the way it treats its minorities. I think it's a very powerful statement, and it's as relevant today as it was, or maybe even more relevant, we could say, than it was when he said these wise words. I'll move then to two people I met in Afghanistan. I was there together with my husband last autumn, and I was there again in the spring this year. I've traveled there many times, actually. And we've been involved in writing a book about Afghanistan, where we've also concentrated on the coverage of minorities and how we should look at the minorities and how they are treated in this country, which has been ridden by war for 3 decades now. One of these Sikh minority people is Daya Singh Andua. He is also a writer, a poet, and he's a media personality. And he tells us the following, that, well, we have always lived in Afghanistan since our religion started in the 1500s. We've always been there. But many people now tell us to go back to India. For me, there's no going back to India. I don't even speak Hindi. I don't speak the language in India. But we are perceived as Indians since we're minority in Afghanistan. That taught me something about how it's very hard for some people to escape their minority status, and how in Afghanistan, a war-ridden country, minorities may fare even worse, because we've seen in Afghanistan an exodus of the Sikh people. Thousands of them have left. There are quite few there now. Same has happened to Jews and to Hindus. So this was just a little start before I turn to Norway, my home country, and to the terror that we saw on the 22nd of July. I used the example of Afghanistan first, just I forgot to say, because Afghanistan has a historical link to Turkey. In the 1920s, when the reformist king Amanullah Khan came to power, he looked to Turkey for modernization of Afghanistan, and he sent young girls to be trained as nurses in Turkey. So it's a long story with these two countries, actually. And I recognize also some of the words that are spoken in Afghanistan in their Dari language are the same as you speak here in Istanbul, which is a further link, of course. Anyway, the 22nd of July terror. There was one single terrorist who blew up the government quarters at 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon. He killed 8 people there and wounded many. And people were really, really shocked. And the same terrorist, he assassinated in cold blood 69 members of the labor youth at their summer camp, and he wounded many. His intention was to kill the former prime minister, our first female prime minister in Norwegian history, Mrs. Gro Harlem Brundtland, but she had recently left, and he was delayed, he has later explained. So he was then, some hours after this, he was captured around 6:30 p.m., and at around 9:50 in the evening, it was revealed that it was not what many tended to believe, a Muslim terrorist. It was a white right-wing extremist who was the perpetrator of these evil deeds. So what is then a lone killer? Because many label him immediately as a lone killer, because they couldn't imagine that there would be more than one of that kind in Norway, I guess. And there was also a debate about whether he was insane, whether he was a lunatic, or whether he was part of a large conspiracy, or whether he was inspired by a large European or global network of right-wing extremism. What we know is that he was indeed very actively participating in European networks, and that he was very active in social media. Okay, the first aftermath, the first hours after the explosion in our government quarters happened, and the building is still not restored till today. They are still discussing whether they should actually rebuild it or tear it down and build something new. There was the suspicion of Al-Qaeda and Muslims behind this deed. And also expertise in Norway, researchers who had done research in the past on terrorism, they were brought immediately, you know how media works, they were brought immediately to the journalist attention, and they had to answer, what do you think, who do you think is behind? And some of them dared to speculate and were then pointing more in the Al-Qaeda and Muslim extremism direction than in any other direction. You see here a picture. This is one of the days I spent in court while this terrorist was tried. This man gave witness. He lost one arm and one foot during the assassination in Utøya. He's a young refugee from Iraq who survived, and he didn't want to have the perpetrator in the audience while he witnessed. He couldn't bear it. And I can understand that. But after this first happened, and before we knew the identity of the perpetrator, in the streets of Oslo and in collective transportation means, there were people looking Muslim. I don't know how to define that really, but some people think that you look Muslim if you have a slightly darker skin than the Norwegians, or if you wear a hijab, or if you have other visual signs. They were attacked, both verbally and physically, and some really badly. They were beaten, and one woman had her hair pulled out because of the anger at the explosion and because people believed that there were Muslims behind. So this version of the story remained for the first few hours. And the harassment was, if not very widespread, at least it was felt by the ones who were the victims of it. So you can say that hate speech and hate deeds prevailed for those few hours in Oslo, and perhaps also around the country. So, but then the identity of the terrorist was revealed, and he was then a blonde Norwegian man, 33 years old, with a right-wing extremist ideology, one who promotes Eurabia scenarios. What is a Eurabia scenario? Well, it is an idea that there is a big conspiracy between leaders of Muslim-majority countries and the European countries that they want to make Europe a Muslim caliphate, more or less, and introduce Sharia all over Europe. That is the short version of the Eurabia theory, and there are many people promoting that on the internet these days. This guy also, perhaps not surprisingly, admires Al-Qaeda, I guess, for the way in which they efficiently also kill. So there is a link between different parts of extremisms. I think that is important to realize. And he corresponds from his prison cell now with German neo-Nazis and with a Swedish right-wing extremist serial killer who went on a shooting rampage in the city of Malmö at the very southern tip of Sweden. One of his ideals is the Serbian extremists, people like Mladic, who were responsible for the killing of scores of Bosnians in concentration camps. And he denies the existence of Srebrenica and the massacres that happened there. Of course, in his writings, he also attacks diversity. Personally, I've done a study on his entries on a website which is a kind of web newspaper called Muslim Critical, not Muslim Hatred. But there he had plenty of entries where he attacked multiculturalism, and he equaled multiculturalism to what he called cultural Marxism. That is his way of further marginalizing people who are pro-diversity. They're all Marxist, and you know the Marxists, they're all communists, and they're all bad. So you make this kind of equalization which makes a lot of people look bad in his and his accomplices' eyes. His rationale then for why does he attack the labor youth? There were people to the left of them, and there were other people who were preaching or adhering more to the multiculturalist attitude than the labor youth. Well, in his opinion, these were the people who were going to be the future leaders of Norway, and thus to kill them made sense, together with the mother of multiculturalism, Gro Harlem Brundtland. It has to be said also that during the Labour Party rule, there has been a rather strict migration politics. It's not that we've had open borders. So the way he spread the myth that people want free migration and that Norway will turn into a Muslim majority country has no factual basis. But he saw the Labour youth, who are, of course, as many youth organizations, as more radical than the largest party in Norway, which is the Labour Party, and thus even more dangerous, I guess. Okay, let's have a look at what some young Muslims had to say and what they had to think about after the 22nd of July. Because the way he explained by his publishing of his manifesto was that he did this because of the existence of so many Muslims in Europe. That was one of the rationales he had. So one young girl wrote to the debate forum on a public broadcasting on the 25th of July, just 3 days after the terror. Hi, I am 13 years old and a Norwegian Muslim, and I felt that this is my fault. He says that he killed everybody since I am here. Should I move to protect Norwegian children in the future? This is how I feel. Greetings from Sofia. Sofia Adampour, born in Norway, out of an Iranian family, she writes like that. Immediately, of course, she's called to the studio. This is how media works, because she's then kind of a, what can you say, freedom of expression hero. And she's discussing here with the one to the left, who's the Minister of Migration and Integration and Equal Rights. But this is maybe a case of how people are, if not automatically, but subconsciously internalizing racist views. If you're long enough looked at as other, if you're for a long time sort of labeled as not belonging to a society, then you might internalize this. You might make it sort of half your own attitude. I feel I shouldn't be here. That's what she says. Because many people have told her so, not least on the web. So the early questions raised after the terror in Norway was, how could this happen in a peaceful, democratic country like Norway? And I guess maybe in Turkey too you might have asked these questions when it happened. I know this was very big international news. BBC World did not have anything else for the first 24 hours. Absolutely nothing. It was very strange to me. I'd never seen BBC like that before. So, has the political leadership and police underestimated right-wing extremism was a question that was quite soon asked. And I think the answer is yes. They were very focused on Islamist extremism and very little focused on right-wing extremism. That went, so to say, under their radar. And that is in spite of the fact that the few acts of terror we had had before in Norway had almost only been done by racist or right-wing extremists. Smaller attacks, killings of people, but usually those right-wing extremists. But that didn't seem to alert, let's say, the police and the secret police and the people who were responsible for surveillance. They were concentrating on other extremisms. So a fundamental debate then occurred as to whether this assassin was insane or mainly politically or ideologically inspired, or maybe it was both. There were 2 commissions of psychiatrists to observe this man and to deal with him, and the first concluded that he was a paranoid schizophrenic and thus insane. This created a lot of reaction in the Norwegian community because they had seen how he had uttered himself in social media and elsewhere and deemed him as politically inspired. There was a new commission appointed which deemed him to be sane and not insane. So this is very rare in Norwegian judicial psychiatry, that you have such a contradiction between 2 different commissions. But the later one gained ground, and it was due to their report that he was then not judged as insane, but he was sentenced to ordinary prison and not a psychiatric ward. Other questions after the 22nd of July was on what kind of society were we? What is the Europe we're part of? It was a debate on pre-22nd of July realities after the terror. And one of the debates raised was, had views critical to Islam or Muslims or to minorities in general, had they been marginalized in the Norwegian media and in the public sphere? And did this contribute, albeit very indirectly, to the terror committed by Anders Behring Breivik? I used ABB for short here. That is his acronym, so to say. That was one question asked. But another question was also asked. Did Anders Behring Breivik, the terrorist, did he feel that he had support for his views and thereby also, maybe by some at least, for his deeds? Did a particular media climate focusing very much on the problematic side of migration and minorities contribute to a certain extent? We cannot say a total yes, but we can suggest that that might be part of an explanation. I think we have to say that. So the background is linked then to how has Norwegian media covered diversity. Well, there are recent researchers and there are older researchers. I could start with my own before I go to the recent one. Together with a colleague, I've done a study on how minorities have been covered in Norwegian press for the past 100 years, that is from 1902 to 2002. But we also base ourselves on some updates. We find that there is a lot of discourses on problem, on how they deviate, the minorities deviate from the majority, and how their humanity is not fully accepted. And as late as in 2009, we saw a very interesting trait, namely that Islam as such is more frequently occurring in the Norwegian press than swine flu, and swine flu was by then a big, big threat. But it seems Muslims could have been bigger. In 2012, there was another survey done by Retriever Research finding that 70% of the stories on migration and integration focused on problems. So if you're a minority, you're a problem unless you integrate perfectly according to the majority model of integration. And that means sometimes, by some people, be exactly like us. And where are then the rights for minorities? We also found, this research also found that there's much negativity registered, particularly with Muslims and with particular migrant groups who are invariably Muslims, like the people from Somalia. And there we might say that there is a link between how foreign reporting looks and how the reporting on the people from the foreign countries who come to our shores are covered. I mean, there's maybe a link between how news media cover Somalia and the way Somalians are covered when they reach our country. This is something at least we've worked on in my research and found some links. Well, there are other aspects. We should focus on some positive things as well. This picture that you see here is of the burial of Banu Rashid. She was 18 years old, killed at Utøya. Her sister survived. And at the funeral, the parents wanted a funeral with both a Norwegian priest, you see the female priest to the left, and with an imam. He's from Bosnia, by the way. So this was a signal, a very early one, because as you may know, as you surely know, Muslims want to bury their people as soon as possible. So the other funerals took more time, but this was one of the first ones. And this picture became kind of an icon of solidarity and unity in the Norwegian people. In spite of the hate speech that we had seen previous to the attacks, this was the opposite. This was an oppositional and maybe a more widespread attitude. But then came some complaints, because the Prime Minister, he said, on the 25th of July, when we had what we call the Rose March in Oslo, we couldn't march because the whole center was packed with 200,000 people. Then the Prime Minister in his speech said, as he had also said on the very first day, we need in this situation more openness, more democracy, but not naivety. We should not be naive, but we need to be more open, and we need to enhance and strengthen our democracy. But then journalists started complaining. Well, you say more openness, but where's the access to information about how police worked, about how the alert was, and about how one had considered right-wing extremists before the 22nd of July. And then we saw, on the other hand, that the media opened more widely the doors to the views of the right-wing extremists, adhering maybe then to the idea that there hadn't been much openness. So we saw more people like Fjordman, who was the main inspirer of Anders Behring Breivik, the main ideological inspirer. He could write chronicles in the Norwegian press. He had access to several media. And it also applied to other people who were related to his ideological views. Then comes in the web debates, the social media debates, the question of anonymity. At least in the mainstream media, where there were who were open for comments, some of them changed their policy and claimed that now the people who write here, they have to reveal their name. If not in the comments, at least to us, so we should know who you are. Not all did that, but some did that as a result of this, and hoped maybe thereby that they should avoid some of the hate speech. Well, maybe they hoped too much, because it didn't stop. And it's, to me, to this day, amazing what people also reveal of views under full name. But it is maybe a better way, because there's also, as I'll come back to, a question of the right for people who are attacked to know who attacks you. It could be labeled as a right, I think. Then, of course, there is a third kind of openness, and that has to do with Norwegianness. Who is to be defined as one of us or one of our own? In many newspaper articles, we found, during a research I did together with 2 students, that they used the expression, he, the terrorist, he was one of our own. Anders, very Norwegian name, he was one of us. And therefore we have to scrutinize the Norwegian society and his psychiatric and other background. How could such a man emerge among us? They must have had belief, of course, that terror is something not Norwegian. It's something else. It belongs elsewhere, of course. Could we imagine then, that was a question posed by many also, if the terrorist had been called Ahmed by his parents and grew up in the eastern part of Oslo, which is the more poor part, while this guy grew up in the western part, and had lived his whole life in Norway, born and bred, Norwegian schooling, everything, would he then have been called one of our own? One of us? I don't think so. And many people with me don't think so. So the question of belonging is also part of the openness of a society. The question of who is allowed to belong. And then, who is the other? I take one small sidestep now, because this has everything to do with hate speech. Earlier on in my life, I worked with the rhetorics of war. That was after 9/11 and after the invasion in Afghanistan. A colleague of mine and myself, we made an anthology then called The Rhetorics of War. And this is just some brief references to our findings. And that is that the military, they often use dehumanizing language. We know that well. But this is also adapted by the media, and very uncritically so at times. And when it's adapted by the media, it becomes more common language among people. So one of the expressions that is used in military is the take out, which is what we call a euphemism, a more nice way to talk about killing, right? We take out this person, which means assassinating the person. And also we found in the rhetoric in the US media and other ways, other places, expressions like mop up. They were going to mop up the terrorists in the mountains of Tora Bora in Afghanistan. Well, mop up. What do you mop up in your daily life when you have to do it? Well, that's dirt, yes. And then what do you flush out? Well, you know very well what you flush out. So to liken the other, the enemy, to dirt and to our own, well, excrements is very, very bad hate speech, in my opinion. We also found during research done in the United States in some weapon factories, there was one lady who was allowed to be an insider in a place where they produced weapons. And there was a lot of sexualized language around the production of weapons. For example, more bang for the buck, and we're going to pet the pet, and things like that. And also we've seen that soldiers, they name missiles that are out to kill a lot of people with nice names too. It's a funny thing that's going on there. There is an old history then when it comes to United States warfare of naming the enemy, and I think it has to do with the psychological training of the soldiers. In Vietnam they were gooks, in Somalia they were skinnies, probably because they were slender. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, invariably they were called hajis, which must have been even more denigrated to some. So this is part of a picture where you dehumanize the other to make it easier to eliminate the other. We could go back and look at what has happened in previous wars. In the First World War, there is at least a story about how on the Christmas Eve, in one of the fronts, the Western Front in Belgium, the Germans and the French and British troops, they were digging in the trenches. They were there and they were clashing every day. But on Christmas Eve, they arose from the trenches and greeted each other and shared some food and some greetings. And maybe, I say only maybe it was harder for the soldiers next day to go back and aim at the same persons, because then they'd seen the face of the other. As Bob Dylan also says in a song, I always include Bob Dylan in my lectures, it's a passion I have. He writes a song about a man who goes out to war in Vietnam, and he comes home, he's aimed and he's blind and everything, and he says, well, Ma, I had to realize the enemy looked just like me. So this has also to do with what the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas says, when he says that when you meet the others, or the other face by face, and you stare into his eyes, then you have some sense of responsibility for the other. So it's a psychological process whereby the other is humanized in front of your eyes when you're close to him, which may make it harder to dehumanize the man again, or the woman. All right, back to the public sphere. That is my field of research, media, journalism. And we are changing rapidly in all countries of Europe, and of course that includes Turkey too here. The public sphere, was there ever one public sphere in the country? Well, I'm old enough to say yes, perhaps there was, at least partly. I mean, 20 years ago, my students and I, or let's say 25 years ago when I started teaching journalism, we could discuss the same TV news. There was one channel. I don't say that that was a very good old world. That's not my point. But we had the same frame of reference. We had read the same newspaper articles. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was nothing like that. So in that way, this public sphere, the one public sphere of a country, does not exist anymore. On the other hand, there's more of a global connection now between people, which did not exist to the same extent then. We know that the assassin, the terrorist, he was very active on social media. But we also know that on one of these social media, he suggested a mainstream newspaper, a right-wing based newspaper. So he was aware that at least the mainstream media still has maybe a more important role to play than these small spheres that are now part of the fragmented public spheres we have. Social media, then, means, of course, we've seen through the Arab Spring, particularly in Tunisia. I think what I've heard is that Tunisia was a Facebook revolution, and I was there just 4 months after, and everybody were talking Arabic, and then you heard the word Facebook, Facebook. So I think Tunisia, yes. In Egypt, they say it was more Al Jazeera revolution, but I think it was also social media. It's never only one thing. So social media can be used for mobilization, for the good, for the change. But they can also be used for the bad, as we've seen in this case of our homegrown or European-grown terrorist. And there I come to the concept of echo chambers, which is part of the new spiricules, as it's called, the new smaller spheres that we found on the internet. Echo chamber means basically you go to a place where you can have an echo of your own views. You can have your own views confirmed. And, well, sometimes I could say that maybe my Facebook group, although it's large now, or my Facebook network, it's about 1,000, I believe, most of them, not all, I wouldn't say all, but many of them share many of my views. And it's a comfort to be there, of course. It's nice to read that, well, what I mean is I'm not alone here. So this is something psychologically not only for me, but for many people, I think. But then again, you have also the subject of censorship when it comes to all kinds of social media, including the cell phone. I was in Ethiopia in 2005, and they'd had an uprising there during the elections just some months before I came. And then what the police or the authorities did was to turn off all the SMSs. I mean, the SMS system was shut down. And that was very important, because then it was hard to mobilize to a demonstration as easy as they'd done before. And the Facebook hadn't gained much ground by then. So also with the growth of the social media, you also see a growth of means of censorship. And they are commodified and sold from the US to China, for example. And you see a lot of commercial channels here trading with tools of censorship. So how to act when you have such a public sphere? Well, I still tend to believe that there is an unofficial ranking between various kinds of media. I think, at least if you look at it from the perspective of reaching the powerful elite segments of a country, the mainstream media are kind of hegemonic. I mean, if a TV debate or a documentary on the main TV channels proves something about a minister in the government, they have to act. If somebody writes something on social media, they might not have to do so. But then again, the mainstream media are fed by the social media at times. They pick up from Facebook and they pick up from blogs if the blogs have substantiated facts. So there is an interplay here also. Then, of course, the increasing right to express oneself is now very widespread. Anybody can open a blog if they have a certain level of media literacy. That was not the case 10 years ago. On the other hand, you can open a blog and you can hope for the best, but you might have 3 listeners, or no listeners, or 3,000 listeners. So the right to be listened to is not as evident as the right to publish. And that might be a problem for the people who want their voices heard, and that's why they are still concerned with the more mainstream media, because those are still more listened to by broader segments of a population. Another aspect of our modern information society is that there's something that the former editor of Le Monde Diplomatique wrote more than 10 years ago, is that we now have so much information that we do not know what we miss. We do not know what is under the media radar often if we are not digging very deeply ourselves. And that is, of course, a problem. So the ranking of the media still exists, and I think that is the reason also that our terrorists wanted to publish a more mainstream kind of journal. So what about web-based extremism? What we see is that the net is used by extremists to strengthen ideological messages and narratives. And they do that quite efficiently. It also makes it easier to join and to initiate contact with more formal organizations and networks, and the risk is lower than if you do it in a more sort of meeting way. You don't have to meet. You can just meet on the web, and you can be anonymous, you can have a nickname. There are all these new possibilities. It also creates new social groups where socially unacceptable views in the mainstream media and socially unacceptable behavior are subject to normalization. I mean, it's sort of normal. I'm not the only one. We're many of us out there. So your own views, even if they're socially acceptable, they can be strengthened. And what we also see invariably in the comments on mainstream media is that they're so extreme at times that many other participants may be scared away. They don't want to participate. This is not serious. I can't deal with this. Here's too many lies. Then there are the legal issues, of course. In most constitutions, there is an article saying that there should be free expressions. We have some limitations when it comes to libel, of course, but we also have a punitive law with an article against racism and against other discriminatory, harsh discriminatory speech, Article 135A. We have had a blasphemy law, but that was abandoned, or that was suggested and voted to be abandoned, as in much of Europe, and it happened in our country after the cartoon controversy that was there with the Muhammad cartoons published both in Denmark, in Norway, and in many other countries. So the question now remains in Norway and is still debated: where do we draw the line? What is hate speech? And should articles such as 135A, should they be abandoned or discarded to enhance even more free speech, or should they not? There are several opinions on that. One opinion is that yes, we need to have absolutely free speech. We shouldn't scare anybody away with law. And another opinion is, and I'm more inclined to be of that opinion, is that if we discard this article now, we give a very wrong signal to our minorities, be they sexual, be they ethnic, be they of other shades. So what you see here is a picture of our previous foreign minister in a mosque together with one parliamentarian of Muslim origin and 3 believers who was there. So we have this collective guilt syndrome that was there in the first hours, as I already told you, after the 22nd of July. And it was not the first time. There is a history here. For example, many Muslims, in a research that I made where there was a lot of in-depth interviews, they experienced that if there was a terrorist act elsewhere in the world, they were asked, so how do you support this or do you not support this? What is your feelings about Al-Qaeda? And these were people who were grown up in Norway, had nothing to do with either, and wanted to speak about Norwegian politics, not about Al-Qaeda. But they were sort of part of this collective guilt syndrome, which is an interesting way that media practices at times. So there's another question that was asked both among Muslim communities and elsewhere: how much hate speech does one have to face? And again, the anonymity question, still practiced by some social media and a lot of social media, and some of the mainstream media also, is discussed. And then, of course, the whole society is subject to the debate on, will people who are harassed or subject to hate speech, will they withdraw, or will they fight for a positive cohesion, an inclusive society where we're part of a larger we? This is still an issue where I live. So some of the post-22nd July discourses that we had, and I think it's part of a larger European picture, is about freedom of expression. Is the mechanism this, that if you are not allowed to utter your hateful speech in the mainstream media, are you then subject to the pressure cooker syndrome, in the sense that you boil over in case you not have this outlet? This is one of the most important discussions that had taken place in Norwegian society. And there was a critique that they had been gagged. On the other hand, research showed that a lot of critical attitudes towards minorities in Norway has always been there. And they've been there to a large extent, and maybe to an increased extent too. And on the other hand, there was the debate on multiculturalism and diversity, which is a split issue. It's both political, it's defense of a diversified Europe, which is a very important thing, in my opinion. But it's also a discourse on what diversity or multiculturalism entails. Does it entail to accept bad practices among minorities? Like, for example, forced marriage? No, it does not. And there's also then the explanatory model that was adhered to by the terrorist himself. Is it so that to promote diversity means that you open up for terrorism? Can you say that? Well, some people say that on the net, and quite a few people are supportive of the views of Anders Behring Breivik in Norwegian web debates today. And also, we found during the last days of the parliamentary elections, there were some pictures of the assassin and remember his manifesto glued to some walls in Oslo city. Must have been done by somebody, not by him. He's in jail. So they're out there, some of these people still. Some of the examples of hate speech I'd like to just mention. First is one quote by the terrorist himself, and this is about the party that he was member of for 10 years, It's called the Party of Progress, FRP. The problem, quote, with FRP is that they strive to attain the multiculturalist claims and the suicidal ideals of humanism. Suicidal ideals of humanism. In other words, to be a humanist is to be suicidal. That's his view. He left the Party of Progress. He thought they were too liberal, as you can see from this quote. And the party also is in government in Norway now and is doing quite some damage repair to try to distance themselves from his views, although not all of the members are as clever at that. Secondly, this is a political candidate for an even more extreme right-wing party called the Democrats. Everything that pleases the Muslims is lawful in Norway. My comfort is that I can take with me some hundreds to the grave. This was a political candidate standing for elections in our not the last elections, but the previous one, in municipal elections. And thirdly, the Norwegian Defense League, the Muslim devils strike again, and now in Norway, kill all these Muslim terrorists. This is incitement to violence, if you ever saw it. And I read also, through a book of a man who has gone deeply into the right-wing extremism in his research, that there's a punk band called Cock's Barrel, and they have a song, or what you call it, a tune called Take 'Em All, with more than 1 million views on YouTube, and it's showing dead Arab-looking persons, etc. I mean, 1 million viewers. It's a lot. It's not as much as what does the Fox say, of course, but you might have seen that one maybe by two Norwegian inventive pop man. Finally, before I wrap up, a small revisit to Orientalism, Occidentalism. I think I'll open up for questions on that cartoon issue or the caricature issue that was a very important part of the European discourse in 2006, 2007. But my experience is that the simplification of the other travels both ways. Orientalism has, according to Edward Said, been a political and military weapon. And it has been used, the view of the other Oriental as being somewhat lower in the hierarchy, more emotional, less rational, and all that, has been used to conquer and rule. Occidentalism is a more new concept, but it has been used by many as a kind of anti-Western mobilization, and thereby also labeling the universal human rights as a Western invention. This is a discourse that is heard often in the streets of, for example, Pakistan, where I've spent 2 of my years. We were actually there during the cartoon crisis and had sort of front stage access to how the reasoning was over there. And again, the media plays a role. You see here below a picture of a very extreme demonstration. It did not take part in Pakistan, but in London. Only 200 people participated, but it made headlines in media, unlike the larger demonstration where more modern Muslims protested in a less hateful way. But here you can see slogans like "behead those who insult Islam" or "massacre those who insult Islam." That's hate speech too. There are many ways of doing hate speech. All right, the challenges to journalism and media then. What are they? I have to talk for 1 or 2 minutes about that because that is where I work. Yes, where am I? Here. Recently I heard, after I prepared for this lecture, that Los Angeles Times has decided something new. This is a large newspaper in the United States. They've decided they no longer want to print or give access to views that President Obama is really a Muslim. This has been proved again and again. That's not true. They say, well, this is not a fact. Why should we practice a freedom of expression to print lies again and again and again? So they are stopping that. They're also stopping climate deniers, which means people who absolutely deny that there is any kind of humanly induced climate change. For the same reason that this is now an established fact by 99% of the serious researchers in the field. Well, is that curbing free expression? This is a question one can debate. And Fox News, of course, was up in arms against Los Angeles Times for their decision. That maybe is no big surprise to this audience. So what we've seen through various research is that the debate on freedom of expression and also on diversity or multiculturalism is often elite-oriented. Researchers debate, politicians debate, media people do so, but that's all. Not so many of the ordinary people do, but they come to give their comments online. We find also that critical and hostile views towards immigration and minorities have indeed not been gagged, and they flourish in the social media. And so do other extremist views, like, for example, we have people who more or less are sympathetic to Al-Qaeda in Norway, a smaller group of Muslim extremists who recruit now also to Syria and other places. So there are several extremisms, and that is the challenge also for the media to work. And there is the importance of facts. And journalists need time to reveal what is fact and what is not. And that is a threatened issue, because journalists have less time now to do more on more platforms with less people. So how to navigate between extremisms is really a question that we need to address. So my perspective is that one needs to trust facts, one needs to allow free expression, and too many rules and laws will not function very well, because if they're aimed first in one direction that we all agree upon, later they might be used against somebody else, maybe yourself. But this very free expression will backfire if we are not practicing our responsibility as citizens to oppose hate speech and then to fight verbal hatred before it turns to be physical and hatred by deeds. Thank you very much.
And Elizabeth Eide'ye çok teşekkür.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth Eide. We'll have a 10-minute break, and after we will listen to Földi and then with a discussion. Thank you.